The Compliance Life details the journey to and in the role of a Chief Compliance Officer. How does one come to sit in the CCO chair? What are some of the skills a CCO needs to successfully navigate the compliance waters in any company? What are some of the top challenges CCOs have faced, and how did they meet them? These questions and many others will be explored in this new podcast series. The Compliance Life is hosted by Tom Fox, and each month he'll present the story of one CCO through 4 episodes. The Compliance Life is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back again for another episode of the Compliance Life. This month, I'm visiting with Gabe Hidalgo. Gabe is, of course, Managing Director at K2 Integrity. Today, we're going to take up the topic of what put the compliance bug in Gabe's ear. And frankly, it's one of the most unique stories that I've heard. So, Gabe, first of all, welcome back. Gabe, you've shared a little bit of this story with me, and I'm going to introduce it by telling our audience that you're a native New Yorker and that 9/11 deeply affected you. I was wondering if you could maybe start with sort of how 9/11 affected you as a native New Yorker and how that started you down the journey towards the CCO chair.
Sure. So back when in the year 2001, I was working as by that point, I think I had already transitioned to outside counsel, helping insurance companies on insurance defense matters. I was working at that point, I believe, in Long Island. My wife was working in Midtown New York. I was on my way to work, and I had my radio on listening to the local news network, 1010 Wins out of New York. Anyone who's a native New York person from New York City knows 1010 Wins. It's kind of the news radio station. When all of a sudden, around 8:40 something, there was a report that a small plane had hit one of the trade towers. Honestly, I couldn't believe it. I thought to myself, that's got to be some sort of inexperienced pilot that kind of strayed from their flight path. And then a few minutes after that, I heard that another plane had struck the other tower. At this point, I knew that this was not a simple accident, but instead was some sort of terror attack. And the reason I had known that was I had done a ton of reading on Al-Qaeda prior to this. In 1993, there was also a similar attack on the World Trade Center. They had done it through a car bomb in the garage. And so I knew that this was some sort of coordinated attack. All of a sudden, I had arrived in the office. Everyone in the office, at that point, we were at the very beginning of the internet, but we had Yahoo TV turned on our computers, and we can see the smoke rising from the towers. At this point, I was very worried. My wife was working in Midtown. I was trying to get a hold of her, but all the telephone lines were busy, were not working. I tried calling her on her cell phone, which again, at that time was a pretty new device. I managed to reach out to her for about 10 seconds. I asked her to please head home now, that this is not a drill, this is not an accident. She needs to get home now. And luckily, she was able to get on the train and head back. At the time, we were living in Queens. She was able to get back home. She got in her car after she got out of the train station in Queens and headed home. I saw the falling of the towers. As a kid, whenever we had family that came from Ecuador to visit, we would take them to the World Trade Center. It was the #1 place, that and the Statue of Liberty were the #1 places that we would take them for visits, for family visits and everything else. It was basically like the landmark of New York City. The skyline of New York City had always, as far as I was concerned, since I've been born, the Trade Center. To see them collapse, to see people jumping off those towers, to see the destruction that occurred on that day. It was a sad, sad occasion for me. It impacted me deeply. That day I cried. I think my wife cried. At that point, my wife, we had just found out that she was pregnant with our daughter. And I just kept thinking, is this the world that my daughter's going to come in, where we're just going to be attacked like this? I I couldn't make sense of it. Living in the United States, we're pretty immune to terrorist attacks because of the oceans that separate us from Europe and the Middle East and Africa and all the other continents. But now here it has come to life, and so that really changed something in me. I wanted to make a difference. I wanted to do something to try and prevent these types of things. Initially, I told my wife I wanted to go to law enforcement or the FBI so I can help them track down, with whatever skills I have, to help them track down these types of perpetrators in the future. My wife vetoed that. And as any husband out there knows, happy wife, happy life. So I wasn't about to go against her wishes. She did not want to see me in the line of fire or have to deal with firearms on a daily basis. She wanted to make sure I was safe. So at that point, I tried to look for other avenues in which I could make a difference, in which I felt like I could participate in the prevention of something like this ever happening again. At the same time, I was getting a little burnt out from my career at the time. So this was kind of a way for me to figure out if there was something else that I can use my legal degree for and all the skills that I had picked up. And so I looked for different opportunities, and then I found one in 2000, I want to say late 2003, early 2004. There was an opening for a director of compliance and general counsel for a money remitter located in Queens, which actually happened to be the money remitter that my family used to send money back to South America, to Ecuador. And so I was very familiar with the company. I was very familiar with how Casa de Cambios work. They were looking for someone to handle both the legal and the compliance side of their business. I could definitely handle the legal side, the general counsel stuff. That was not going to be an issue, but it never worked in a compliance capacity. So anti-money laundering compliance, sanctions compliance, all these things I had not done before. So I instantly started to do the research on it. I understood that I could do that I could learn it pretty quickly. So when I went in for my interview, the owner of the company sat down and we had a really good conversation. I expressed to him how I knew about his company for a long time because my parents have been customers for a long time, using their services to send funds to support our family back in Ecuador. He asked me about my legal experience, and I gave him kind of like what I had been doing and what I was capable of. And then he asked me about compliance. And I'll never forget what I told him. I said, if you give me 30 days, I promise you that I will be up on all things AML and all things sanctions to make sure that you have the best policies and procedures and program that you could possibly have. I said, I just need 30 days to kind of catch up, to do the research, and then, I'll be okay. I'll be fine. He took a chance on me and he gave me the job. And that kind of is the turning point for me, the pivot point in career-wise. It's a very different, I think, very different path than most people have.
Could you talk about some of the places you worked and maybe one or two of the highlights from each of those, or kind of what you learned through this journey of AML compliance?
Sure. So I worked at the money remitter for, I think, about a year and a half. At that point, my brother, who had graduated from NYU and had worked at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, had moved over to Deloitte. And I was at his birthday party and I met some of his colleagues from Deloitte, and my brother had, I guess, bragged about the work I had done for the money remitter and rebuilding their compliance program and getting a seal of approval from DFS, well, the banking group at that point. It wasn't DFS yet, that came later for New York State. And so basically they set up an interview for me at Deloitte. And so when I met with them, they were looking for someone who had Latin American skills, the ability to speak Spanish, and had experience from an AML standpoint for money service businesses. And what I found out was they didn't really have a lot of people who had worked at a money service business, like a money remitter. And so banks, they needed help in that area because a lot of their clients were money service businesses. They needed to understand how to set up monitoring systems, how to ask the right questions of money remitters, that sort of thing. So I joined Deloitte as a senior associate and began working with them. And I was part of their global AML team. Michael Zeldin was my boss. So if Michael's listening, thank you for the opportunity, Mike. I really appreciate it. I worked in the global AML team on different projects. Luckily, one of those projects was with North Fork Bank, which ended up being Capital One. They were acquired by Capital One Bank. And Capital One, North Fork Bank at the time, came to me. I had been working for Deloitte for almost 2 years, came to me and asked if I would be interested in being their director of their new FIU that they were setting up in New York, their transaction monitoring group. It was a great opportunity. And at the time, my mom, she had just been diagnosed with cancer, so I needed to stay home. I couldn't travel. And even though I loved the work I was doing at Deloitte, I needed to stay home. So this was like the perfect opportunity. Norfolk Bank is situated, well, I was situated in Melville, New York. So being in Queens and doing the reverse commute to Long Island was an amazing experience. I learned a lot. We built out the new transaction monitoring platform for Norfolk Bank, which ultimately became Capital One. It was the first time that I had used Actimize as a system, which at that point had been a new system that was kind of cutting edge. So I learned a lot there. I learned a lot about developing alert rules, transaction monitoring, setting up appropriate workflows, proper documentation, all these things I learned. I appreciated my time at Capital One. And then after Capital One, I went to work for Morgan Stanley because they needed to build out their compliance programs and update some of their compliance programs for their industrial banks that they had out in Utah. And so I was part of a 4-person team that helped. My role was really building out their AML compliance programs. And then we had other people on the team that built things out like Reg W, suitability, that sort of thing. And so I helped not only with the bank, but I also helped with the broker-dealer side as they wanted help in kind of putting together and updating some of their alert rules. So I learned a lot about the broker-dealer side. I learned a lot about the banking side. And then after that, I was recruited by the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, who had seen my work that I had done at Morgan Stanley, and they were impressed by it. And they recruited me to be a senior AML examiner within the team. I really loved working at the Federal Reserve. It was by far probably one of the best jobs I ever had. I was there for almost 4 years. I started out as a senior AML examiner. I was part of different teams that were assigned to examine some of the largest banks in the Federal Reserve Bank's portfolio. And then after 2 years of being a senior AML examiner, I was promoted to be a legal and compliance risk specialist, where I was assigned to one of the 10 largest banks in their portfolio to basically oversee the legal and compliance risk and to basically do annual exams and be an on-site presence of the Fed for this bank. So, they had to provide reports and I had to review basically everything and then provide reports down to the Board of Governors in DC in regards to the status of both their legal program as well as their compliance program. That was an amazing experience. And if any of my Federal Reserve Bank colleagues are listening, I love you guys. I really enjoyed it. After that, I was recruited by HSBC to work in their legal department as a senior counsel, to be the liaison to the monitor. HSBC had recently had at that point, the largest AML fine in history placed upon it. They had an independent monitor assigned to them, and I worked as the liaison between the bank and the independent monitor and their team. And so the legal team, myself, and the compliance team, we all worked together to basically make sure that the monitor had all the documentation, that all the interviews were taking place, that we were responding on time and on point to whatever the independent monitor wanted to see. At the same point, the compliance team was redoing their policies and procedures to improve them based on the feedback from the independent monitor. I would, from time to time help the compliance team with their policies and procedures. I would be, someone that they would send policies to review. I would help them with edits or other viewpoints, or give them insight based on regulatory expectations, given my experience at the Federal Reserve, of what it is that needed to be in these policies. I worked at HSBC for almost 2 years, and then I was recruited by ItBit, which was my first foray professionally into cryptocurrency, virtual assets. I had been a big cryptocurrency enthusiast since 2011. In fact, I gave a presentation to my colleagues at the Fed in regards to cryptocurrency back in 2011. They all laughed at me, and I think a lot of them were saying, this is just funny money and things that little kids are going to do in their parents' basements and everything else. And so now it's kind of blossomed, but back then, everybody was talking about the white paper and is this really a thing? So anyway, I ended up working at ItBit as their global head of compliance. I put together their compliance program. I was there during the first DFS exam of ItBit. We received the first in the United States, the first charter, financial institutional charter, a limited purpose trust ever given to a virtual asset service provider. That was done through the hard work of everyone at the company. I was basically brought on to help shepherd that, to help shepherd the program. It was a great experience. I met a lot of great people. We were basically pioneers in this new area. I started there in 2015, so it's really where you first started to see kind of a professional atmosphere occurring in this area. You started to see more and more companies starting up in this area, and that was a fantastic experience. I then was recruited by Community Federal Savings Bank to be the chief compliance officer for the bank. It's so CFSB, as it's known, is a bank that's very fintech friendly, and they work with various fintechs to get them into the American ecosystem through their programs and everything else. And so I was brought on to help rebuild the compliance program, to help them with their examination process, to basically reset the compliance program, and also to help them kind of sort through the various candidates from a fintech perspective in regards to the candidates that the bank should be working with. That was a super important part of my career, because I had a lot of touch points with various fintechs and various stages of development. And being that I had just come from a startup, I understood what it was like for these companies to go through their funding stages, to go through their development stages, to go through their implementation stages. And so I had a good understanding of that. And I think that helped a lot in the development of the fintech onboarding at the bank. So that's CFSB. And then after that, I was recruited, after 2 years, I was recruited by Noble Bank International, which was a startup challenger bank, to be their chief compliance officer. So that's 2 times in a row that I was the CCO at a bank. It was a challenger bank, which is basically a new bank, a de novo bank. And the mandate for Noble Bank International is really to basically set up a bank that would be crypto friendly. And the reason for that is, in the early stages, a lot of banks would not open up accounts for virtual asset service providers because they were too risky for a lot of banks. Their risk appetite tended to be a bit conservative, and so many banks would say no. We were the alternative. We were able to have that opportunity. And so after being the chief compliance officer at Noble Bank International, I was recruited by K2 to basically start heading up the virtual asset services practice, basically the crypto and fintech practice at the firm. And that's where I'm at today as a managing director.
Well, Gabe, unfortunately, we are near the end of our time for this episode, but I hope our listeners will join us for our next episode, where we take a look at you moving into the CCO chair. I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Great. Thanks a lot, Tom.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox. Thank you again for listening to this episode of The Compliance Life. I hope you'll join me again next week where I take up another episode with Gabe Hidalgo in The Compliance Life. The Compliance Life is a production of the Compliance Podcast Network. If you would like to be featured on The Compliance Life, please give me an email at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. Also, if you like this series, please give us a rating on iTunes. Any review and rating would definitely help get the word out about the latest addition to the Compliance Podcast Network. Thanks again.